February 1943. The deserts of North Africa burned beneath a relentless sun. For months, the German Afrika Korps had fought the British across sand and stone, veterans hardened by years of war. And now, across the dusty horizon, they finally saw something new. Fresh faces, green uniforms. The Americans had arrived. The Germans laughed. They had seen the propaganda, the Hollywood newsreels. Smiling young men waving from ships, confident but untested. To Rommel's officers, the U.S. Army was nothing but an industrial toy. Powerful machines, yes, but no experience, no grit. They called them amateurs in tanks. At first, they were right. The Americans who landed in North Africa during Operation Torch in late 1942 were brave but inexperienced. Many of their officers had never led men in real combat. Their Sherman tanks, new and shiny, rolled across the dunes like giants on parade. But the desert would not forgive mistakes. Their radios jammed with sand, engines overheated, and worse, they didn't yet know the cunning of the man waiting for them. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel's men had survived years of brutal campaigns. They knew how to fight in the open desert, how to hide tanks behind dunes, strike, then vanish before the enemy could react. To them, the Americans were loud, predictable, and clumsy. In mid-February 1943, the Germans decided to test this new army. Rommel gathered his remaining panzers, a mix of Mark III and Mark IV tanks, a few dreaded Tigers, and experienced Panzer Grenadiers. He planned to attack the Americans head-on at a narrow gap in the Atlas Mountains, the Kasserine Pass. The pass was a funnel of rock and dust, surrounded by ridges that could trap an entire division. Holding it was vital. If the Germans broke through, they could split the Allied line and threaten the ports of Algeria. If the Americans held, they would prove themselves for the first time in the war. At dawn on February 19th, the German guns opened fire. Shells screamed across the valley, slamming into the thin American defenses. Men from the U.S. 1st Armored and 34th Infantry Divisions scrambled for cover. Many had never even heard the sound of a German 88 before, the most feared gun in the world. Its high-velocity shells tore through the air with a whip crack, punching holes through Sherman tanks like paper. Within hours, the front collapsed. German half-tracks rolled past burning vehicles. Panic spread. Communications broke down. Some American units retreated without orders, not from cowardice, but confusion. The desert was chaos, smoke, dust, and fear. Rommel's troops advanced swiftly. They captured ammunition dumps, supplies, and even entire convoys intact. One German officer later wrote in his diary, "The Americans fight bravely, but their officers do not yet understand war." By February 20th, the situation was desperate. Thousands of U.S. troops were scattered, cut off, or retreating west. German loudspeakers blared taunts in English. "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms." Some believed it. Others fought on. At headquarters, confusion reigned. American General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the Second Corps, from a bunker over 70 miles behind the lines. He gave orders by radio to commanders he had never met. Units became isolated. When they called for artillery, shells landed miles off target. The front was dissolving, and Rommel saw his chance. He ordered his panzers to press through Kasserine and drive deep into Allied territory. He believed he could destroy the American army in one blow, the same way he had shattered British lines years before. For the young U.S. soldiers, it was a nightmare. Tank crews watched their shells bounce off the frontal armor of German panzers. Infantry crouched behind rocks as Stukas screamed overhead. The Luftwaffe ruled the sky. Men who had enlisted with dreams of adventure now found themselves buried in the sand, praying the next bomb wouldn't find them. But amid the chaos, Small acts of courage began to appear. At Thala and Jebel Semama, isolated American units refused to retreat. Artillery crews fired until their guns overheated. One battery of the 9th Infantry Division held its position under constant bombardment, buying precious time for others to regroup. A sergeant later recalled, "We didn't know what was happening. We just knew we couldn't run any farther." Behind the lines, reinforcements raced forward. British tanks, French troops, and remnants of shattered U.S. units. Among them was a new commander who would soon change everything, Major General George S. Patton. He hadn't yet arrived at Kasserine, but his reputation already filled the desert. He was ruthless, demanding, and obsessed with discipline, and he was exactly what the American army needed. For now, though, Rommel had the upper hand. By February 21st, he had pushed nearly 50 miles beyond the pass. American columns retreated through villages, pursued by German armor. Civilians fled. Roads. By the evening of February 22nd, the smoke had settled over the Kasserine Pass. The desert was littered with burned-out Shermans and half-tracks, the twisted wreckage of trucks, and the footprints of men who had fled in panic. Rommel's Afrika Korps had won, but not decisively. He had taken ground, but not the victory he wanted. Behind him, his own supply lines were crumbling. Fuel was low, ammunition scarcer still. The German High Command demanded miracles, but Rommel knew every mile gained in the desert cost him dearly. Still, he looked west toward the broken Americans and thought, "They're not ready for this war." But back at Allied headquarters, someone else was watching too. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, had seen enough. He sent a telegram that would change the course of the campaign. Immediate reorganization of U.S. Second Corps required. New command structure effective at once. And the man chosen to rebuild the shattered army was George S. Patton. When Patton arrived in Tunisia in early March 1943, the Americans were still reeling from Kasserine. Discipline was broken. Morale was low. Tanks had been abandoned, weapons lost, units scattered. Patton's first order wasn't tactical. It was psychological. He made every soldier stand at attention when speaking to an officer. Uniforms had to be spotless, helmets polished. Even in the desert heat, no excuses. Men cursed him under their breath, but slowly something began to shift. The chaos turned into order. The fear that had paralyzed them at Kasserine began to turn into focus and rage. Patton toured the front in his jeep, twin pearl-handled pistols on his belt, barking orders with the energy of a man who refused to accept weakness. He told his troops, "You may not like me, but you will damn well fight like me." Under his command, everything changed. Tanks were refitted and repainted. Artillery was repositioned for coordinated fire. Units trained endlessly. Live fire, movement, communication. He drilled them until exhaustion. And he reminded them that they were not there to survive, they were there to win. Meanwhile, Rommel's own confidence began to crack. His fuel convoys were being bombed daily by Allied aircraft. The Afrika Korps, once the terror of the desert, was exhausted. And the British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, was pushing from the east. Rommel now faced two enemies, and both were closing in. By late March 1943, the Americans were ready to strike back. Patton's Second Corps had regrouped along the Gafsa line, reorganized, resupplied, and burning for payback. What had once been chaos was now precision. Each division knew its role. Each crew trusted their commanders. And above all, they were no longer afraid. At dawn on March 17th, the counterattack began. Artillery thundered across the desert. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, led the charge, advancing methodically under fire. Their Shermans rolled forward, not in panic this time, but in formation. Each gun fired in rhythm, covering the next. Rommel's forward units were caught off guard. The Americans who had once fled at Kasserine now fought like veterans. When German tanks appeared on the ridge, American artillery zeroed in within seconds. Their gunners had learned. No more wasted shells. Every shot counted. A German officer captured after the battle later said, "They looked like the same men, but they were not." Something had changed. They had learned war. In the skies above, Allied pilots dominated for the first time. American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires hunted Stukas relentlessly. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Africa, was losing control. The balance of power was shifting, and fast. By March 23rd, Rommel ordered his forces to retreat toward the Mareth Line. His grand North African campaign was collapsing. And though he had inflicted heavy losses at Kasserine, it no longer mattered. The Americans had survived their trial by fire. And now they were unstoppable. A few days later, Patton visited the battlefield where so many had died. He walked among the wrecks of tanks and trucks, the sand still black with oil and blood. He stopped beside the burned hull of a Sherman, laid his hand on the metal, and whispered, "You boys paid for this ground. The next ones will take it back." And they did. By May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were marched into captivity. The same Americans who had been mocked as amateurs now guarded the veterans of Rommel's army. The lesson of Kasserine was burned into their memory. A brutal teacher, but one that forged steel from fear. When news of the victory reached home, American newspapers called it redemption. But the soldiers knew the truth. Victory hadn't come from glory or luck. It had come from learning the hard way, from discipline, unity, and the refusal to give up after failure. One young lieutenant from the 1st Armored Division wrote in his journal, "Kasserine taught us that war doesn't forgive pride. You win it by surviving, adapting, and standing your ground." Rommel, too, would remember it. Years later, he admitted to a fellow officer, "The Americans, they make mistakes, but they never make the same one twice." Kasserine Pass was more than a battle. It was a transformation, the moment when the United States Army was reborn in the fire of real war. The Germans had laughed once, but after Kasserine, no one laughed again. The wind blew softly over the barren hills of Kasserine. The sun was rising again, the same sun that had watched thousands die only weeks before. But the land was quiet now. The smoke was gone. The battlefield, once filled with chaos, had become a graveyard of lessons. To the Germans, it was a temporary victory. To the Americans, it was a rebirth. For the young soldiers who survived, Kasserine Pass was burned into memory, not as a defeat, but as the moment they truly became soldiers. The desert stripped them of illusions, of arrogance, of the Hollywood version of war. It taught them that courage wasn't loud. It was steady hands, calm breath, and the will to keep fighting when everything falls apart. In the days that followed, Patton continued to shape them into something Rommel himself began to fear. He made every man accountable for his weapon, his vehicle, his uniform, his soul. He told them, "Discipline is the soul of an army. Without it, you're nothing but a mob with guns." And they believed him. They started to walk differently, talk differently. There was a hardness now, not born from cruelty, but from understanding. They had seen what chaos costs. By April, the U.S. Second Corps was no longer a rookie formation. It was a professional fighting machine. And the proof came soon enough. In the last great battles of the North African campaign, El Guettar, Maknassi, Hill 609, the Americans struck back with vengeance. At El Guettar, U.S. infantry dug in against a massive German tank assault. The 10th Panzer Division came roaring through the valley, confident of another easy victory. But this time, the Americans didn't break. Hidden anti-tank guns opened fire. The first German tanks exploded, their turrets thrown into the air. The rest tried to flank, but every move was countered. For hours, the desert shook with the clash of metal and fire. When it was over, more than 50 German tanks lay burning. The Afrika Korps had been stopped cold. One German officer later admitted, "We no longer face the same enemy we met at Kasserine." Word spread fast across the front. The once mocked American army had become efficient, aggressive, unpredictable. Even the British veterans who had doubted them began to respect their speed and precision. They called it the new way of war. Fast, flexible, relentless. By May 13, 1943, it was over. The Axis armies in North Africa surrendered, nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops captured. Rommel had already been recalled to Europe. He never forgot how the desert that had once belonged to him now belonged to the enemy. In a letter to his wife, he wrote quietly, "The Americans, they are learning too fast. They will be our greatest danger." He was right. As the sun set over the North African coast, American soldiers stood among the wreckage, tanks silhouetted against the golden horizon. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just watched the sea, knowing that ahead of them waited Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and a war far from over. But they also knew something else, something Rommel could never take away from them. They had faced the best the Germans had to offer, and they had survived. Back home, in small towns across America, telegrams arrived, some carrying the worst news imaginable, others announcing medals, promotions, or simply the word alive. Mothers hung flags in their windows. Factories worked through the night. The nation understood now. This war was real, and their sons were ready. The laughter that once echoed in Berlin radio broadcasts about the inexperienced Americans was gone. Instead, German soldiers began whispering a new phrase at the front: Die Amerikaner lernen schnell. The Americans learn fast. Years later, one veteran of the Afrika Korps would describe the change in an interview. At first, we thought they were nothing. By the end, we knew. They were us, only younger and stronger. The irony was that Rommel and Patton, two men who never met face to face, were cut from the same cloth. Brilliant, fearless, obsessed with speed, and addicted to risk. Both understood that war rewards adaptation. But only one of them would live to see how far the Americans would take it. After North Africa, the U.S. Army transformed completely. New doctrines were written. New weapons rolled off production lines. Men who had once stumbled through the desert now led armored divisions across France, commanding with the confidence of veterans forged by failure. And behind every victory in Europe, every bridge taken, every town liberated, there was a shadow, a memory of the place where they first learned what it meant to fight. Kasserine Pass, the crucible, the lesson that cost blood, pride, and innocence, but gave birth to greatness. By 1945, the same army that had fallen apart in North Africa was storming across the Rhine River, crushing the Third Reich. Patton's tanks rolled through Germany at lightning speed. The Luftwaffe was gone. The Wehrmacht shattered. And for the first time in history, American flags flew across Europe, not as symbols of arrogance, but as proof of resilience. One German general reportedly told his captors, "You Americans were amateurs when you first came. Now you fight like gods of war." When the war finally ended, Kasserine Pass faded from headlines. Other names took its place: Normandy, Bastogne, Berlin. But among soldiers, it was never forgotten, because that was where everything began, where America stopped pretending and started fighting, where boys became men, and where an army, untested and uncertain, discovered what it was truly made of. Gabi Gabreski, who flew above Europe, once said, "War doesn't teach you how to kill. It teaches you how to live with what it costs." Kasserine taught that lesson to an entire generation, not just the men who fought, but the nation behind them. It proved that the greatest power in war isn't experience or technology, or even leadership. It's the ability to learn faster than your enemy. The Germans laughed once, but they weren't laughing when the thunder of American guns rolled across the desert, when the sky filled with P-47s and B-17, and when the same green troops they mocked were the ones standing victorious on their doorstep. Narrator's closing line, Kasserine Pass was not the end. It was the beginning, the moment the world realized that the Americans had arrived and they were never leaving.